Fabulous. Thank you so much, Amy. And particular thanks to Gary. So that's Air Vice Marshal Gary Waterfall, who's very kindly joining us today for a chat about his an RAF career full of variety. And I'm sure many of you will be very aware of Gary and some of the things that he's done in the Air Force. And some of you will know him as a Harrier pilot, Harrier Force Commander, some through the Red Arrows, perhaps some through his work in the Olympics, and some more recently in terms of what he's done with as AOC1 group, and then moving over to Northwood and his joint forces command. Is that the right word? I've just gone a completely blank there, Gary. It was JFC, wasn't it, you were at?
It was GFC, and I worked within the permanent joint headquarters there, so PGHQ, Rachel. Hello, Rachel, how are you?
Hi, I'm very good, thank you. So, Gary, I've asked a couple of other people this over the last few weeks, but was joining the Air Force something you always wanted to do, or did you have a different career path in mind?
My first career path, Rachel, I was going to be a vet. We lived in Stamford at the time, where we now live just outside Stamford, and I must have been about, I suppose, 8 or 9. And I wrote to the vets in Stamford saying, can I come along and get some work experience, please, because I really want to be a vet. And it didn't materialise for whatever reason. I didn't go and because I was obviously too young to go and do that. Then when I got to secondary school, I realised you had to be quite clever to be a vet. And then in the background, I'd always had an interest in aircraft. My father was in the Air Force. He retired in the late 50s as a warrant officer. Mm-hmm. So we'd always lived on Air Force stations. I'd moved around a lot with him, and it was kind of in my blood. So when I went through school, I went to school at King's School up in Grantham, and I was a member of the CCF. And it was something that I wanted to do at the expense, a bit ashamedly, in terms of education. For me, it was all about wanting to join the Air Force and wanting to be a pilot.
And you did that as a direct entrance, so you did that from school, or?
Yeah, no, straight from school. So I tripped out of school in the summer of 19, a few years ago. Had the summer, in fact, in that summer, because I was part of the CCF, I already had my pilot's license, because I did that at 17, my glider's license at 16. And then at the summer period, I went on a thing called an International Air Cadet Exchange. And I went to Germany, having spent a lot of my life in Germany, being born in Germany. I went on exchange to Germany, it's a bit of a waste. And then that September, end of September, 29th of September, I joined the Air Force at age 18.
So you really do credit a combination of your father's service and the example that he set you, but also the CCF and the RAF Air Cadets for, your career.
Yeah, without a shadow of a doubt. So, as a child, I remember we lived in loads of varied places. And I've always liked traveling. I've always liked meeting people. We did a lot of time in Germany. Dad was also based in Norway. And whenever he went away, he was the crew chief on the NATO General's Andover sort of twin turboprop aircraft, which I know many of the people in the association will remember. And during holidays, we would go with the General. So we went to the Edinburgh Tattoo, and sometimes I'd just sit on the aircraft if they're doing engine runs. So I really enjoyed it. And then when Dad was in Germany, I can remember standing watching a Jaguar at full power, which isn't that exciting, but at the time it was, at the age I was, on the chocks. And then, when I then became part of the cadet movement from the CCF, for me, I got a lot out of it. It instilled the discipline in me, the leadership side of it. And I don't think without the cadet movement behind me, I would have been mature enough and ready enough at age 18 to join the Air Force and go through pilot training. So what it gave me as a step up was just unbelievable. And that combination of that and then being at home, and my grandfather, my mum's father, he was in the Air Force as well. He was an engineer at Bryce Norton, and my grandmother worked in that Gateway House. That was the place.
Oh yeah.
That dreaded Gateway House. I always had it in my blood, as it were.
And so you made the decision, or it doesn't sound like it was really a decision to make. You decided you were going to join the Air Force, and you were determined that you would join as a pilot, or you were really just happy to join whatever you had the aptitude to do?
So my decision was to join as a pilot, and that's what I wanted to do. But I think when I went through the aptitude tests, had I not qualified to be a pilot, but I'd been suitable for other roles, I definitely would have done that, because for me, it was joining the Air Force I wanted to do, and being a pilot was the icing on the cake. I think what I did do, and if there are any cadets either listening live or listening into this afterwards, I absolutely put going to the Air Force front and center of everything I wanted to do at the expense of studying for exams, etc., etc.
So
by the
that's not
time
advice you're going to give people. I just want to
correct,
quickly go.
that's just it, Rachel.
Checking.
My advice is always have a plan B, and I only had a plan A. So when I then went through pilot training, etc., I knew if I failed the pilot training, I was going to have to find another job to do within the Royal Air Force. I wouldn't have an option B of leaving because I didn't have the academic qualifications behind me to be truly competitive.
I think it's really interesting because a couple of the other people, I'm pretty sure Jerry Mayhew last week said something similar around his advice was definitely to focus as much as you can on your academic learning.
Yeah, you've got to. If you don't, then you won't have a plan B. And now I look back, and I know mum and dad will be listening live or listening afterwards, and they'll be laughing at this. But I do wish I'd listened to some of what they said, and given myself worked harder. But then, hey, had I done that, would I have been the full person going into it? You never know. But what I would say is, had my time again, I would have worked hard at the academics so that I had the choice in what I wanted to do.
So you were accepted into the Air Force as a pilot. You went to Cranwell. How did you find your IOT, your initial officer training experience?
Pretty brutal. Prepared. So my secondary education was at boarding school. So again, I sort of learned to be relatively independent. But I arrived at the back end of September, and most people on my intake were graduates. There weren't many people coming straight from school. And at age 18, the difference between you at 18 and someone who's 21, 22, having spent 3 years at university, is quite large. So a big learning curve for me to go through the initial officer training. At the time, it was only 18 weeks long. No hiccups for me. I really enjoyed it because I didn't mind being told what to do. And likewise, I quite enjoyed telling people what to do in terms of the leadership side. And that's what it really taught you. So it was a great experience, fond memories. From there, in terms of going to basic flying training, I stayed at Cranwell. So I wasn't traveling far from Grantham or indeed escaping Lincolnshire. But the people that I worked with through officer training, indeed basic flying training, we're still really good friends now. We've got our own WhatsApp group, and we still stay in contact, and we still have regular reunions. So a real bond that you build that stays with you forever.
So flying training, how did you find that? Challenging? You clearly must have a natural aptitude for it.
But yeah, so flying training was really, it was straight on to the Jet Promise Mark V. So I've done 38 hours in a Cessna 150, and then found myself in this jet aircraft with an instructor sat beside me. It was pretty horrific. And again, that's all the experience I had. Everybody bar one other on my course were all graduates. They'd all been part of the University Air Squadron. So they'd got a lot of flying experience. And for us, Al Bridger and I, Al, he is now the Director of Flight Ops for British Airways. So we were the only two sort of young kids on the course. Real steep learning curve. You were only as good as your last trip. And, being chopped, being told that's it, was only a ride or two away. But you went through the basic flying training at at Cranwell. Halfway through, they stream you into Group 1, Group 2, or Group 3, which are fast jets, rotary, or multi-engined. And then you go on and finish the rest of the course. And I was fortunate. I was streamed into Group 1, which meant I had to do low-level navigation at 300 knots versus 240, learn some formation flying. And then at the end of that, graduated from Cranwell. A great joke in the family is I graduated from something about every 6 months or so, it seemed. So I finished basic flying training and then moved on to RAF Valley up in Anglesey. And
eventually were selected to convert to fly the Harrier.
Yeah, so you go through Valley. At the end of Valley, you get your wings. Valley for me was the closest I came to the dream finishing. And I got to a sort of a chop ride on navigation. My skills have improved since on navigation mostly. But we then went to applied flying down at Chivenel Brawley, the tactical weapons unit, where you learn how to operate the aircraft. Came good for me. And at the end of which I was selected to fly the Harrier up here at RF Wittering.
So I'm not going to go into lots of jokes, and I'm sure people will pop them through if they wish. But there is, of course, within the Air Force, there's lots of banter and lots of sort of preconceptions of what the Harrier Force character is like. Was going into the Harrier Force at a relatively young age compared to perhaps some others, was that daunting?
Yeah, it was. You're right. I mean, we've been chatting now for 10 minutes, and it's the first time I've told you I'm a Harrier pilot. Normally, it happens in the first couple of minutes. Yeah, it was daunting, and it was very much an old school Harrier. It was converting from, it was still GR3, the GR5 were just coming in. It was a hard school and an uncompromising school and a really tough school internally, and the standards were exceptional, and you had to meet them. And the aura, if you like, of the force from a pilot perspective was very much that of kind of arrogance, prima donnas, if you like. But actually, once you got in that, I found them to be a great bunch of people, almost without exception, that were just focused on a task at hand. I also felt that the bond between the aircrew and the ground crew was really strong, particularly when I got on the front line in Germany, because we spent a fair amount of time in the fields, living in tents, not with the engineers have their own tents, pilots have their own tent, but nevertheless, there's a lot of mixing that went on and a lot of dependence from you in terms of the ground crew, because you're in that cockpit all day, and they were looking after you as much as servicing the aircraft. And, you know, that I think carried through with me in terms of the bonding, you know, from the air and the ground crew. And I guess if it didn't, then I'd always have my father sort of, you know, nagging me over my shoulder that it takes more than just pilots to fly the aircraft. And he's dead right. And it's such a team effort. And it's not just pilots, engineers, it's the whole support staff, everybody that gets to putting the lucky person up in the air, flying the aircraft.
So when you joined the Harrier Force, what was the focus of Harrier Force activity at the time? Because obviously it changed over the years.
Yeah, it did, Rachel. So right at the start, it was just at the end of the Cold War. So lots of camping in forests in Germany. And just after I arrived, we were denied access to the low flying system because the wall had come down. So we spent a lot of time flying over the UK, still low level operations. Then, of course, the first Gulf War happened, which the Harrier Force wasn't involved with, and a shift then up to Middle East focus, an era that went into us sort of flying ops over northern Iraq, based out of Turkey, and policing. And then the carrier came along as well, and Joint Force Harrier. So a move from low-level 30-minute sorties, you know, any other pilot will tell you how bad the Harrier is in terms of range, to actually going into flying a similar profile as Tornadoes or Jaguars, doing quite long-range missions, demanding using a tanker, doing it from land or sea bases. So I saw over my time in the Harrier Force, the aircraft, the role and the mission changed hugely.
And do you have some particular highlights of, I mean, before you kind of got command of a squadron, do you have particular highlights of when you were a squadron pilot on the Harrier?
Yeah, I think when I look back at what was the most fun as a squadron pilot, it was probably living in the field, where you're with, you know, the bond of brothers that you've sort of, you know, grown up with, going flying training, and you're spending every day with them. You've got some real good friends, and you're doing something that's really complex, a little bit challenging, you know, intellectually and also physically, sitting in the cockpit all day doing that stuff. But you then come back and you can play hard as well as working hard. So 4 years in Germany. So my wife, Yvonne, she was serving on the Sister Harrier Squadron. She was the squadron adjutant and intelligence officer. So we sort of got together and we had, you know, 4 years living in Germany, having a really good time, both at work and socially as well. You know, definitely a great tour.
It's always seemed to me that the Harrier Force is quite close knit. I mean, I know from experience of other forces as well, similar, but particularly, and do you think that's partly because of the time, and it was Larbrook, was it, or Larbrook?
Yeah, it was Goodslow and Larbrook, and I think they are quite close knit, and it comes back from the demanding standards that are set. You know, once you've met those, then you're kind of part of a club, I suppose. And you know, fast forwarding to where I sit now, as you know, with the demise of the Harrier, I end up being the chair of the Harrier Force Association. And, you know, from a pilot perspective, we've got a big WhatsApp group going, and we try and get together, you know, a couple of times a year, because the bond's still there.
Yeah. And so some slightly less traditional activity for you during that period as well, because you were selected to become the Harrier display pilot.
Yeah, so I did 4 years in Germany, came back, by which time I was a weapons instructor, instructed on the OCU. And I'd done a couple of air shows in Germany, and as a kid I went to air shows, so I sort of followed around the likes of people like Spike Jepson when he displayed the Harrier in Germany, and Mark Zanker. Came back to UK, and Andy Offer was selected as the display pilot in '95. So I sort of was his spare pilot really, and took the aircraft around for him. And then naturally in '96, I displayed the aircraft for a whole season, did either 60, 70 shows around Europe. and Farmer as well. And it was a real, in terms of flying the aeroplane, definitely the highlight of that aspect of it.
So there's flying the aircraft. That's obviously a key part of being an RAF display pilot, and we'll talk a little bit in a moment about your time on the Reds. But it's not just about flying the aircraft, is it? There's all of the ambassadorial, meeting the public, etc. Representing the Air Force around the world. Did you take to that?
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons I wanted to do it, actually, because we're all taxpayers. I've always thought to myself to be really privileged to be given £1 million worth of aircraft to throw around the sky. Actually, a bit of payback to allow the public to see what they're paying their taxes for, and particularly something like the Harrier, because it is so iconic, to enable them to watch it and appreciate it. And then afterwards, and before that, meeting the public, talking to the public about the aircraft, about my career, and it might be the mums and the dads and the adults they're talking to, or it might be, the up and coming, the aspiring kids, the amazing kids that sit there or stand there in their flying suits, just want to be a pilot. And it's amazing. I still see people. In fact, I went to a meeting at Waddington. Well, it would have been over 2 months ago because of this lockdown. And I talked to someone, he said, "You won't remember me. I was an air cadet and you inspired me to join the Air Force because I came to see you when you were the Harrier display pilot and you just let me sit in the cockpit and it was brilliant." So going out, meeting people, I'm sort of that sort of person. I do enjoy going out. It's got its challenges if you're in the middle of a high pressure day, because nobody else will understand what's going on inside your mind. But absolutely, one of the highlights of doing it, apart from pure flying, was just going out, meeting people and traveling.
And do you have any air shows that you remember with particular fondness?
So from the Harrier era,
Yeah.
then it was probably the display I did at Goodwood Festival of Speed, where I went with a guy called Paul Warmby, and we operated out of Goodwood Grass Airfield. So there aren't many jets that you can park on the grass. So we pitched up at Goodwood Airfield, we had lunch, and then I got airborne and did the display and then landed back at the grass, which was just brilliant. North Weald, Middle Wallop, another sort of army base. And again, that's all grass there. Just going somewhere where everyone else is flying in and flying out of the display, whereas you can actually display. I do remember I displayed down at Yeovilton, and Yeovilton at the time had a ski jump ramp. So, and it was right by crowd centre. So I said, right, what I'm going to do is I'll start the display coming off the ski jump ramp, because what better way of showing the Harrier's unique qualities? Of course, that's the first time I'd done that. Whereas normally I'd get airborne and go to a tight turn. I knew exactly what I was doing. And I remember coming off the front of the ramp, bringing up the undercarriage, and then just thinking, right, now what? And it completely blew my mind for what I should be doing. Then quickly gathered where it was. So yeah, loads of great memories from that display year.
And did you go straight from that to the Reds, or did you go back onto the squadron first?
No, straight from there to the Reds. So by the time my season started, the first public show I did was in Cyprus. I'd already been accepted to join the Reds at the end of that year.
Okay.
And the Reds were still out there. They'd just done their Red Suit Day. So my first display was in front of the team I was going to join in September. No pressure whatsoever.
And at that point, where, I, as some of you may know, I worked with the Reds for a number of years, just a little bit after you left, Gary.
Yeah.
And I remember when I first arrived, the majority of the team pilots at the time were Harrier pilots. Was it the same when you were on the team?
Yeah, it was. It wasn't exclusively, but most of the team pilots at the time were either Harrier or Jaguar pilots, pretty much exclusively.
And how did you find? Obviously, you'd done an awful lot of flying on a squadron, exercises, etc. You'd had your year displaying. How much of a shock was it to go to the Reds in terms of, we've talked about exacting standards of the Harrier Force, but I'm very aware myself of the incredibly exacting standards that the Reds have. And I've seen pilots cope with that in different ways. Did you find that it was as difficult as you expected, less difficult?
I nearly took up smoking. So Smithy and I joined at the same time. Smithy smoked, and you would do 3 trips a day every day. So the first month on the squadron, I flew 57 sorties. And up until that stage, all of my flying, even when I was learning to fly at Cranwell, in a dual aircraft with an instructor, at some stage he'd say, right, I have control, Gary. And he'd fly around for a bit and you have a bit of a breather. Or if you're flying by yourself, you'd go, right, I'm just going to do nothing for a couple of minutes and just get your own internal thoughts and capacity back. Flying with the Reds, from the moment you checked in until the moment you closed down and got out of that aircraft, it was about 300% concentration. From starting up, taxiing out together, lining up, taking off, the concentration just did not stop at no stage. So the drain on you mentally, let alone then the physical side of doing relatively high G maneuvers 3 times a day. I just remember being asleep on the sofa most nights at about 8, 8:30. And it was just relentless. And then the exacting stands that you talk about, actually, it was relatively very open to start with, while people help and mentor you to get into the right position. But then once you've been told that, well, you're now expected to be in the right position. And certainly there was no dual instruction, although the aircraft's 2-seat. A lot of the maneuvers, very few of the maneuvers would be demonstrated to you. The rollbacks was one, and I think the twizzle was another one. Apart from that, you would do it by trial and error. And then at the end of every trip, you would debrief. The debrief on video would be utterly relentless and uncompromising. And the video would stop as you're all crowd center. There would then be silence, and you would have about a couple of milliseconds to jump in and say, 3's wide, 3's short, late smoke. If you didn't, you would then be had at by someone else saying, I think you're short there, Gary. I think you're long there. And they're all terms for where you are in the formation. And very quick, you learned that honesty is the only policy, and everybody fesses up. By the time you take that to Cyprus, where you're doing 6 weeks worth, and I think my first year we did 75 shows.
That was Winterhawk.
Yes, Springhawk.
So did you do Winterhawk and Springhawk?
No,
just did Springhawk
we did Springhawks, yeah.
In your era?
Yeah, in my time, last century.
Dark ages.
Yeah, last century. We did 3 Springhawks, and they were, so each time we'd do 75 shows in 6 weeks. And that was 8 o'clock in the morning, 10 o'clock in the morning, 12 o'clock, without fail. And that was really tough. If your smoke was out a frame compared to everybody else, you're paying £1. When you park the aircraft and put it on chocks, if you're out by 6 inches, that's going to cost you £1.
And it's not really the pound, is it? It's more it's the fact that you feel you've let everyone else and yourself down.
Yeah, and that's it, the sense of teamwork. And within the team, everyone had jobs. One person's jobs would have been customs to sort out when you're going somewhere. Other jobs would be sort out the transport or the food. So I, as a pilot, didn't have to worry about what I was eating because someone else did that for me. And if that individual failed to do that duty, everybody, as a result, came down a notch. But I think the biggest sense of failing is when you're in front of the public, if your smoke was late, if you don't, because in the second half, when there's lots of crazy formation changes going on, if you don't get back into formation by the time you're in front of the crowd, you feel awful because you haven't let yourself down. It's that old saying, you've absolutely let the whole team down. And by extension, you put that out, you've actually let the Royal Air Force down, or the country if you're displaying internationally, which again I was privileged to do. Sounds a bit grand, but it's true, and it's how you feel in the cockpit when you're under 6, 7G at the time.
So did you have moments during that first winter before you did your first public display authority? Did you have moments where you thought, I'm not sure I can do this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I came back from a particularly testing day, and Yvonne was at home. So at the time we had Alex, our first, so she was born before we left Germany, and she was pregnant with Oliver, who was born at the start of the first summer season. So during that first winter workup, I came home one day, and Yvonne had painted, I'll never forget it, in the downstairs toilet, she had painting the skirting boards a terracotta, which sounds gopping now because it's white walls, but at the time it was trendy, trust me. And I walked in and I was absolutely knackered, and I looked at what she'd done. I went, why have you done that? I'm about to get chopped. We're going to have to march out of this quarter probably tomorrow because I'm going to fail tomorrow, and that's it all over. So it really was, you were only ever as good as your last trip, a constant sense of, I won't do this. Like, I guess, anyone who's tried to get fit, you never really think you've got to fit because all you ever do when you go to the gym is try as hard as you can. And all I was doing was try as hard as I possibly could. And some days that just wasn't good enough. So you might be really good on a formation reference, and then you'd end up in a really turbulent day and you're all over the place, or the sun would get in your eyes. And if you mentioned the sun, that was a financial penalty as well, because you couldn't complain about anything. You had to just do with it what it was. So yeah, it was definitely, and I didn't stop learning through that whole 3 years. People often say to me, must have got a little bit blasé by the end of the third year. By the end of my third year, each sortie was as challenging as it was in the first. I think I had more capacity. Down the back, I did 2 years at Red 9. I could sit there flying maybe a prospective candidate for next year, talking away quite happily while still being able to formate. Whereas the first year, I couldn't say a word. I was just concentrating on the aircraft beside me.
What got you through those dark moments where you know, not just the difficult bits, but the things when you thought, I am going to have to repaint that skirting board tomorrow?
And it was also was it the Freeze, the sort of band Yvonne put that in Alex's room on wood chip wallpaper? That would have been a nightmare to get off, as it was when we left as well. It's the bond of the team. The bond of the team. So, you know, Andy Offer, I've mentioned Andy. You know, Andy was, he joined the team the year before me. So he'd been through the first year. Everyone had been through the first year. And now they were second years or third years. And, you know, some team members are more, well, you'll just get it, so get on with it. Far more of them were all, okay, let's work together. And of course, the three of you that joined in the same year, so myself, Smithy and Andy Cuban, were really sort of, you know, strong mates and would talk to each other about what's going wrong and what's going right. Smithy and I, he was 2, I was 3. And from a 9 ship, the whole formation is really built on how steady we are as 2 and 3 either side of the leader. So he and I got really close. And again, you know, we're still, you know, the best of mates, you know, some years later.
So I just encourage at this moment, anyone who wants to ask Gary a question, please do start messaging those through to Amy and she'll relay them on to me. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask you, from my time on the Reds, questions that I know we used to get asked an awful lot. So, can you maybe first of all just explain the way that the formation is split into 2 sections, so Enid and Jippo, and how that works?
Sure. So the format, or the whole show is split in 2 halves effectively. So there is the iconic 9 ship, the Diamond 9, and the first half of the formation is based around what is called the stem of the formation, if you like, so the leader and then the 2 people behind, which is Red 6 and 7. And then the left and the right hand effectively move around into various shapes to give those formations. It then breaks into the second half into the front 5, which are called Enid, that do set pieces, and then the back 4, which are known as Jippo, after one of the team members many, many years ago. And the Jippo then further subdivide into the synchro pair, which throw themselves at each other at ridiculous miles an hour. And then Jippo staying together as the 4, and probably the iconic Jippo break is probably one of the better maneuvers that, as seen from the ground.
So when you're flying, when the 9 ship are all in formation, what sort of speed and height, what are the kind of parameters?
So down to 300 feet up to about 4,500 feet at the top of the loop. Generally, the leader will peg the speed at about 360 knots, and he stays as stable as he possibly can do, obviously. Wherever you are in that formation, you are looking at the leader. So when I was Red 9 at the back end of the formation, I would ignore all of the metalwork around me and look through all of it and find a spot on the leader as my reference. And that's simply that you are now you're only formating on one person. Whereas if I was formating on somebody who was formating on the leader, he would be just wobbling around slightly, and then I would just be wobbling. So it just to get that builds as it goes further down. So wherever you're on the formation, you're looking through all the other aircraft and just picking the leader, a reference, and staying on that. So yeah, 4,500 feet down 300 feet and about 360 knots.
Just maybe, because I know from previous experience that people, maybe just explain to people a little bit more when you say picking a reference, exactly what you mean.
Sorry,
the
Rachel.
fact that it's done all hand-eye and the kind of references that you're looking and that you're lining up, because I think that often quite astounds people. There's no kind of special tech happening here. It's pilot eyeball.
So there are bits on the airframe. So for me, in some of the formations, there would be the tip of the wing. If I was sat next to the leader, the tip of the wing, and where the tip of the wing meets a bit on the fuselage as I look across it. So I'm looking down the tip of the wing, and it actually hits what was the CFS badge on the side of the fuselage. So that's one of the references. And what that's doing is effectively, I can line that up and I'll be anywhere along this point here. So what I need to do is make sure that I'm in the right position. The way to do that is I then have another reference on the tailplane. And when the tailplane tips, I could see them in line together, sort of like that. I knew that I was exactly in the right place. And then, of course, there's the up and the down. And that is helped by where the wingtip is, whether you're up or down. Can you split the wing, as it's called, or can you see too much top surface or bottom surface? So all the time you're doing that. And of course, the leader isn't absolutely steady because he's being bumped by the air, you're being bumped. So you've got to try and get that right. And that was just for one of the positions. And then as the formation position changed, then clearly that reference would change. So to again put that into context, one of the formation maneuvers, Concord, where you've got the leader up the front and that left and right side have now slipped back from being here to back here, even as red 9. So I'm right back, far, far away in the formation. I'm trying to ignore everybody and I'm picking a reference off the leader and just lining up a couple of aspects and staying true to that as much as I possibly can do. So no clever computers, all done on hand and eye, and what the eye is seeing, the hands are then. So the stick's constantly moving, the throttle's constantly moving, just to keep you in the right place.
And not just to be in the right place in that formation, but actually in the right place as you move from different formation configuration to another. So
yeah, and all done in terms of cadence and timing. So all the formation moves, if you hear the radio, there's all a cadence in the way the boss speaks. And the other thing, of course, from the leader's perspective, if the leader says pulling up now, or pulling up as you would call into a loop, if you waited for him to move, as I'm sat way back there, I would be way behind the formation. So you have to trust what he's saying he is going to do. So he literally would say pulling up, and at the up, I would then start to pull. And if I didn't, I'd be way behind it.
Did you have a favourite, maneuver or formation shape or?
Yeah, so I think for me, Apollo was probably the best formation of the first half. Because that was the closest formation in terms of nose-tail clearance. And we used to do a quarter clover, so you'd pull up into a loop and then twist it through 90 degrees over the top. And I would sit down the back as red 9, and you'd be as close as you possibly could towards the other aircraft. And in my third year with a bit more capacity, if you fly a new prospective team member, he sat behind you, he's a bit higher, so all he can see is this jet pipe in his face. And meanwhile, you're talking quite merrily. And I think, the biggest picture I take away from that, loads of these sections, was we displayed at Weymouth for the Radio 1 Roadshow. And we were in the middle of the quarter clover pointing vertically down on a summer's day over the beach at Weymouth. And it was packed with people on this Radio 1 Roadshow. I'm in this Apollo formation with everybody. It was just brilliant.
And I recall from my time on team, there were specific manoeuvres that everyone detested as well. There was great groans when they came back to a show in a year. Were there any? I
never really enjoyed the rollbacks.
No, I knew you'd say the rollbacks. Lots of people didn't like the rollbacks.
So I hated the rollbacks. So the rollbacks were from Enid in the front 5, and then you went down the line, and under the call, you would then pull up, roll around the rest of the formation, and come into it. I guess the back of my mind, well before I joined, a Lightning pilot called Clatchy actually, unfortunately died during the World Cup through rollbacks. So, it always was there in the back of my mind. I remember cautious, but it wasn't a maneuver I enjoyed. And if you didn't balance it just right in terms of the buffet and the power, you could be way off the back of the formation, and therefore comes back to you feel like letting the team down, etc. So not enjoyable. Second half for me, we did the corkscrew, which is where I'd roll around synchro smoke. That you're only as good as your last one. And that could go wrong as well, and you'd end up being spat out of the formation. So in terms of the ones I didn't enjoy, they were probably the 2 manoeuvres when I look back on it.
And how critical are you now when you watch the current Reds show? I mean, I love watching Reds, the current, every year with kind of past pilots.
So I was
entertaining.
Yes, correct. So I try not to be, because I know how difficult it is, but you can't help yourself. And of course, Purty, who's the current leader of the Reds, he was brilliant. Though last year, as you know, I sort of left the Air Force last year. So there was a day organised, and I went up Scampton on one of their in-season practices. And I had the opportunity to fly in my old slot as Red 9 in the back seat with Dan Lowes as the current Red 9. And just full of utter respect and admiration. I'd forgotten how violent and vicious the whole thing is, actually. I spent the first probably 5 minutes looking out the front, trying not to black out or throw up. And then after that, I really enjoyed it. And really privileged at the end of it, they sort of let me fly some of the big battle formation, which are the biggest formation. and back to learning, listening to the cadence of what people are saying. It was a great privilege, and real respect. Nobody, unless you've done it or been really, really close to it, can ever understand how difficult and challenging it is for them.
And I think, clearly we are both biased in different ways, but I think for me, and what you said earlier, it's, the excellence, professional excellence of the pilots, but that whole support crew that goes into it, every single person on the squadron is, makes an absolutely vital kind of contribution. And it's not just around the professional excellence of the Royal Air Force, but as you pointed out earlier, I personally, every time I see them, I feel so proud. Having seen a trillion red shows, I feel so proud. I think around patriotic pride, representing the best of British.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, some of the overseas stuff, you are, exporting the UK brand. And back to what you were saying, the team spirit extended well beyond the people in the red suits. If the die wasn't in, you couldn't fly. If the hotels weren't booked, it was an utter shambles. And the reliance that the pilots placed on that was just as big as they placed on each other to get their sort of jobs done. And utter pride. And I think even the last show of the year, you debriefed in the same way you did the first show, so it never stopped.
So fast forwarding a few years, and I suppose still kind of staying on that same theme actually of British excellence, you were involved in a fairly senior way in terms of the air security for the Olympic Games. Can you tell us what you can about that? I realise some of it you won't be able to share, but
I didn't take part in the Olympics, you'd be glad to know. But I'd come back. I was so after finishing Collismore, I went to do a bit on sort of the Libyan campaign, and then when I came home, 2012, year of the Olympics, and I was kind of the deputy for AOC1, worked with him, and he was in overall charged with the air security for the London Olympics to ensure that we had a safe and successful games, and that the air presence was kept to a minimum. The threat that we were worried about was a terrorism threat coming into the London Olympic venue. So what we had to do was come up with a comprehensive plan for that. And it was multi-layered. It included putting Typhoons down at Northolt on 5 minutes readiness to get airborne. And I think everybody just think about from where you're sat right now, getting out, getting in your car and getting to the end of the road in 5 minutes would be a challenge. Now imagine if you sat in a Typhoon cockpit. So we had that, we had helicopters with airborne snipers, we had some ground-based air defense radars, and we had some spotters all the way around the M25. And the aim of that was then to have a graduated response to prevent anyone from coming into the London Park. And to us, there was a lot of here about the reputation, because whilst a terrorist incident would have been an extreme and what is what we trained for, we always trained for the worst, the most likely was probably a hapless aviator who'd got lost, or maybe somebody who wanted to use the public stage for his own demonstration, his or her own demonstration. So that's what it was there for, and it worked really well. We trialled it over the May Day bank holiday, because of course it was all centred around London, which I was about to say is the busiest piece of airspace in the world, was the busiest space in the world, running at about 95% capacity the whole time. So for us to just get airborne in the middle of that and break that apart to actually intercept a road aircraft took a lot of interaction with the civilian authorities and with government as well. So in the opening and the closing ceremonies, I was down in the bunker at High Wycombe, so looking after all with one of the senior government ministers. It was actually the then Home Secretary, Theresa May, who was down with me for both the opening and the closing, whilst the guy in charge, Stu Athag, got to go to the opening and closing ceremony.
You're not bitter.
No, not at all. I still mention it.
And am I right that the Typhoons have moved closer to London?
Yeah, so they went down to Northolt because where they sit at Coningsby, and they perform, as you've seen it out in the news, in terms of the counter-terrorism role, as well as policing against long-range aviation from Russia. That just wasn't quick enough as a response time, because what we needed to do around the London airspace is give everybody the freedom to manoeuvre and approach Heathrow. So the area that was actually restricted was quite small. And that meant, because of time distance calculations, the only way of making that possible was putting the Typhoons down at Northolt versus having them up at Coningsby. And
was that well received? I mean, the idea of moving military fast jets, to the centre of London almost.
Yeah, well, it was, again, much of this was making sure that we were there to be shown as a deterrent. and not offensive. So in terms of the messaging around the May workup and the May sort of public demonstration, I remember being interviewed by Jonathan Beale as the Typhoons landed, just to say, look, this is about reassurance. And of course, from Heathrow perspective, they were very nervous of it, but just by working together, and for the Typhoon Force, because they were doing that as well as holding their traditional quick response alert at Coningsby and up the road at Lossiemouth, and indeed the Falklands. So it was a busy period for them, but hey, the sun gods shone on us. It was great weather. Everyone had a great experience actually overall, but I know no one does, but you shouldn't underestimate the work that went into it underneath.
Mm. Yes, and the fact that we know little about it shows that it went seamlessly.
Yeah, definitely.
A good result. So I skipped over, and I shouldn't have, I skipped over after the Reds, you obviously went back to the Harrier.
Yep.
And you were single-handedly responsible of getting rid of the Harrier.
Yes, I hang my head in shame. So yeah, that's not what I thought it was going to be. So I went to Command Cottesmore. Really, for me, it was the dream job. I'd lived at Cottesmore as a child when we came back from Norway, actually, and I went to Cottesmore Primary School. And now I found myself the station commander with my window open in the summer, listening to the kids in the primary school that I'd attended. Quite bizarre. But then, the Defence Review of 2010 occurred, and the decision was to get rid of the Harrier. And that was in October 2010. I kind of fought quite hard to give us a bit of breathing space, because to me it was important for everybody in that Harrier community, which stretched all the way back to 1969, and also, frankly, for UK and the Great British public, you can't just get rid of an aircraft like the Harrier. It ranks along the Spitfire and Concorde for me. So we're given 2 months to kind of work out how to gently lay her to rest with the respect that's deserved. And during that 2 months, what we did was, from air traffickers to engineers to pilots, get as many qualifications as we could for them. So when the force closed and they went off to get other jobs, they would be as well prepared as they possibly could be. The people that it was worst for were probably the civil servants, some of whom there for 30, 40 years, and we had to deal with them very sensitive. Of course, it became Kendrew Barracks, and a lot of them stayed working there or went down the road to Wittering. But for the force, it was carrying on carefully over 2 months, getting people's qualifications up, and then leading to the eventual event on the 15th of December, where we flew a 16-ship formation. I sort of led the formation. There was no other option, really. I had to. And then the last bow in some pretty atrocious weather. And that was it. That was the end of an era, unfortunately.
And how difficult was it to maintain morale during that period?
Rachel, that's another great question. Like with the situation we currently find ourselves in these unprecedented times, it's really interesting. You get to learn so much about people. People you think are outward focused, community spirited, etc., suddenly become quite insular and selfish. And yet you get others, and I will single one out here actually. Jim Calvert, who's now running 29 Squadron at Coningsby. He at the time was a young junior pilot flying Harriers. And after we stopped flying, all the Harrier pilots effectively went off on skiing holidays, sorted out what their next jobs were, etc., which is fine. Jim Calvert came to see me as a young junior pilot and said, look, excuse the interruption, what can I do to help? And at the time, I'd just lost the OC General Duties flight. She'd been posted away, and because Cottesmore was closing, they wouldn't backfill that post. And at the time, as we were going through the closure of the station, more than ever, we needed somebody to sort out the admin into outreach into the community. So I said, right, fine, you can be OCGD. And he stood up and he did, and he was just brilliant. The morale was interesting. People who had arrived on the station didn't really care what was happening in a couple of years' time normally, but all of a sudden everyone was focused on what it meant for them. A great deal of, for me, a great deal of compassion for them. Everyone wanted to know what was next for them. Add into that, I had the Navy and the Air Force. Relations between the two services weren't that great at the time. And I had to try and hold everyone's hand, love everyone equally, really, and make sure they got the right outcome. So as a leadership challenge, probably, at the time, I thought that was definitely probably the biggest leadership challenge I had, to bring everyone together through it so we could stay as mates and everyone gets what they want out of it.
So a testing time, but possibly one that helped you in terms of your future, some of your future command roles. And in fact, that plays into a question, I don't know who it's from Joe, Can you tell us how your RAF career progressed through the ranks to AVM? Was it something you saw you wanted, or did one thing just to lead to another and there you were?
So I have been surprised, as have most of my friends and indeed my parents, each and every time I got promoted and put into a new job. I've always, people have asked me this question before, and I've said, I think I've always had incremental ambition. As a Squadron Harrier pilot, I never ever thought I would display the aeroplane or indeed go to the Red Arrows. And then as a flight commander, that was okay, that was a natural extension. But to be a squadron boss, no, old people are squadron bosses, aren't they? To be a station commander, well, they're really old, crusty people. And then you find yourself there. And I never had a desire to be AFC 1 group or be an Air Vice Marshal. But you kind of do as much as you can in the job you're doing. Back to what I said earlier about trying to get fit. You never know how well you're doing, or you're doing as well as you possibly can. And I've always been lucky and rewarded with a promotion, but also some really good jobs. So I think to answer the question, as a schoolboy joining, I didn't want to be an Air Vice Marshal whatsoever. That was just too grand, and I'd never ever get there. But each time you get to a new rank and a new position, you settle into the role. Suddenly you think, oh, do you know what? I think the next step is within reach. I think I could do that. And there's always something out there to keep you going.
So tell us a little bit about the two roles I think you had at that rank as 2-star, ASC 1 group, and then JSC role.
So the first role on promotion was ASC 1 group. So 1 group is the kind of combat air arm of the Royal Air Force, all the combat air assets. It's got all the reconnaissance assets, and it's got the air command and control that sits with it as well. And it came with a ride-along job, a secondary duty, if you like, of being the United Kingdom Air Defence Commander. Small job. So as you know, obviously from the air security for the Olympics, it was a good step up to be able to do that. So in terms of the stations, an awful lot of stations around the country, a command role, going around doing annual formal inspections, which many of the people watching will remember, and just looking after the generation of that air power to then contribute to defence operations around the world. I did that for 18 months, and then really fortunately, I was selected to do a defence job at the Permanent Joint Headquarters, to be the Chief of Staff and be the Deputy Chief of Joint Operations. So any one of the services gets picked to do that job. I was lucky to get selected. I followed behind Stuart Ather, actually. I think there have only ever been 3 airmen in that job in the 20 odd years it's been going. There, my job was to plan and execute global operations. So as a natural follow-on from the Air Force generating, should we say, combat power from Typhoon, it would then be given to PGHQ to use that operationally. Fascinating job. I thought I knew what was going on operation in the world. I didn't know half of it. And what the Air Force was doing was great, but what the Navy and the Army were doing was just awesome and compelling. I got to travel a lot. I went to places that you won't find in the Thomas Cook brochure. I went to Somalia, South Sudan, Mali, Niger, Iraq, Afghanistan, meeting all 3 services on operations, and really humbling to see how people go out and put themselves out and do that extra mile pretty selflessly. And I think, just at the moment, we find it difficult in terms of this isolation where we are in the UK. I think it's always worth sparing a moment for thinking about those that are deployed right now, who have got their families back at home, enduring the same isolation we are, but they're disconnected from it all, more remote. And I think it just makes it a bit more challenging for them.
The uncertainty is even greater if you're 1,000 million miles away and you don't know what's on the ground with your family. Yeah, absolutely. So let's go to a couple of questions. Okay, this is from Drew. I'm not suggesting for a minute that you haven't had a full, exciting and rewarding career. I'm sure you'll be the first to acknowledge that you've been an extraordinarily lucky man. But as icing on the cake, did you get an opportunity to fly any of the BBMF aircraft? That is literally your cake and eating it, potentially.
Yeah, it is. It is. Well, Drew, do you know what? Will it be a regret that I've never flown a Spitfire or Hurricane? Yes, probably. So as ASC 1, one of the roles there was to look after the Battle Memorial flight. So I would do the public display approval, and I would have the final arbitration on whether it was a good show or not. What I did do is, having done the ASC role for about a year, I said, right, I want to become pilot in command on something. I didn't want to waste other people's time and doing it at Typhoon. So I went up and flew the Chipmunk on the Battleborough Memorial flight. And Dunk Mason, a good friend at the time, he was the boss of BBMF. And he sent me solo, so I did 2 or 3 joules in the Chipmunk and then went solo. And afterwards, Dunk sat me down and he said, okay, so what's the story here? Why are you doing this? I said, well, Dunk, it's just so I remain air-minded. There's nothing else. He said, so do you want to fly on the flight? And of course, what I actually said was, well, here we go, Dunk. If I can stay flying this Chipmunk and build the necessary currency I need, then I would absolutely love to fly the Hurricane. But that means I've got to get 25 hours in this Chipmunk and I've got to remain a level of currency, and you would be the arbitrator of whether or not I could do it. It would be that simple. I didn't find the time to carry on flying the Chipmunk. I could have done, but it would have been expensive of all the other aspects of the role of ASC1 Group. So yeah, a regret is never flying a Chipmunk, a Hurricane or a Spitfire. That would have been great. So they're lucky, the people that get to do it. And if you ever get the chance to meet the pilots and the ground crew again on BBMF, it's just great what they do to keep that flying museum going in the way they do it. And to see them flying over Captain, now Colonel Tom, last Friday, I think was really evocative and captured the nation's hearts.
So one from Michael. This is back Harrier. Did you ever carry out vectoring in forward flight? Because the Harrier certainly showed its capability when flying against Skyhawks in the Falklands War.
Yeah, so vectoring forward flight, or VIFing, what that is where you point the nozzles, because in conventional flight you'd have the nozzles pointed backwards, and what you would do then is put the nozzles forward to slow you down markedly, or to change your vector in your forward flight. So that's what you would do. And did I use it? We'd do it in air combat. It was never that really sort of you had to watch how you were doing it. You had to work very hard at it, because as you did it, it would slow you down, but it would make the aircraft quite unstable. So it would be very easy to depart. So you could find yourself literally with your target aircraft doing mock air combat. You'd be just behind him and you just couldn't get the nose on enough. So you'd put the nozzles down to do the vectoring of forward flight, but you'd be watching him, not the aircraft. The next thing that would happen is the aircraft would just topsy-turvy, and you'd find yourself out in front of the aircraft you were trying to shoot down there, and he'd shoot you down. So it was great, but you have to be very careful using it.
Do you miss flying?
Massively.
I get a sense of that you do. Do you have any opportunity? I mean, not at the moment, clearly, but do you have any opportunity to? Because so what I haven't sort of said to everyone is obviously that you left the Air Force at the back end of last year.
Yeah.
Beginning of this year. Yeah.
Yeah, end of last year. Yeah.
And you've embarked on an exciting and varied new career in scary civilian street.
Yeah, so I'm doing some consultancy. I'm trying to help defence from the outside in. So I'm working in the defence fields, working in the aviation field. Still love being around aeroplanes. If an aircraft were to fly over an hour, I would stop and look up, because it's great. So I've always had that lure. There's a really good friend of mine who's a farmer nearby. I've been flying with him once. I did a little bit of flying on the Air Experience flying at Wittering, but I haven't maintained that because I haven't got the time to devote to it. But when I have the time and space in my life, I definitely get my private pilot's license back. I had it a few years ago, and I spent my time taking people flying, because it's such a privilege to be up in the air looking down, and as many people in the world should experience as they possibly can. So
rather a lot of your time at the moment is being spent, I believe, on helping the association. So you're an RAF Association ambassador, but you've taken that a step further in terms of your cycling endeavours. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about what you and some of the others are planning at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. So I'm enjoying being an ambassador and a befriender as well. And just a bit on befriending, befriending is something I really enjoy through RAFA, but it's something all of us can do, particularly at the moment. Pick up a phone, talk to somebody you haven't talked to for a while, because you don't know how lonely and isolated they are. And I think that's something all of us can do. In terms of the cycling, so we have an annual cycle event, 100-miler, which this was the third iteration we were doing in June as RAFA. Clearly, because of the current restrictions, we can't do it. So I don't know why. I think it was a bit of a mad moment. I have a turbo trainer, and I thought that what we could do is ride the 100 miles on a turbo trainer. I've gathered 9 other foolish individuals to come and join me.
And who have you gathered, Gary?
So I've got Dunk Mason, who we've talked about. I've got Purty, who's current leader of the Reds. I've got other ex-Reds, other people that either I must have some dirt on them or they're just foolish, but they've all agreed to join me, and we're going to cycle 100 miles. So we're doing it on the 14th of June. And we're also now reaching out as an event that others can get involved with. We're calling it the RAFA Virtual Ride, and actually build a team of 10. You can cycle on your old exercise bike that you've got in your house for 10 miles. And all we're asking other people to do is collectively for 10 people, cycle 100 miles. That's only 10 miles each, and try and raise £100. Why am I doing that? Because I think being an ambassador, I know how RAFA sit, and I know the demands that are placed on RAFA. And if we can just help in terms of what's going on now in terms of Op Connect to make it more sustainable, then I think that'd be really good. So we're really lucky. We've got a great bunch of people doing it. We're virtually doing it on this app called Swift. And in fact, this morning I was with a guy who works with Rolls-Royce, Dom Lyons, good friend, and we were cycling along for about an hour together, linked up together by voice and also watching on the screen. So it's brilliant. There is a Just Giving page. Should anyone feel this was great entertainment, then feel free to hound me out through Google and contribute because it's great. And all we're doing is really helping ourselves. And that's the way I think it, because, you know, I'm helping out RAFA because, you know, one day I get a lot from what I'm doing. I get as much out of my befriending relationship as I hope I put in. So anyway, we can help each other because that's where charity starts, in the RAF family, as far as I'm concerned. So help me to help each other.
You know, I slightly wish that I could, I don't know if it's a Swift account or whatever, but I cannot imagine the level of banter between the 10 of you during this 100-mile torture session. So it's going to be epic.
So we had a rehearsal, our first ride together last Saturday, and there were about 8 of us, and it was just constant. And in fact, as Amy would probably testify, we had a Zoom catch-up on Monday, and it's pretty horrific, actually. I don't know what Amy thinks. I don't know how exposed she has been to it, but there is, well, you can imagine what it's like. It's like sitting around a crew room with a bunch
Probably
of
couldn't get a word in edgeways, I imagine. Poor Amy.
Not one, which is a surprise.
It is a great surprise for Amy.
Anyway, well, we've almost come to the end of the time on our session. So I just wanted to say thank you so much, Gary, both for spending the time with us today. I think there's some really fascinating insights that you gave us there about some aspects of your career in the Air Force and life in the Air Force that probably people don't get to hear about very much. But also thank you in advance for the actual blood, sweat and tears that you're going to be unleashing, and the team that you've inveigled together for the RAFA Rides virtual. So that's going to be a huge support to us, especially as we're still maintaining these 4 emergency projects, including Project Entertain, in some somewhat challenging times. So I can't tell you how grateful we are, because it's going to make a really tangible difference to how we can continue to do those projects. So thank you. And thanks to everyone else. I know in these days of slightly heightened security, it's a bit difficult. We used to do a kind of traditional mug raise. So I think only Amy, Gary and I can see doing the traditional mug raise, but I know everyone else at home will be raising their mugs. Oh, Gary, woefully badly prepared.
I did have.
Harrier pilots, I don't know.
Thank you, Gary.
It was really kind. Thank you so much, and look forward to seeing everyone again soon. And if you're available tomorrow, don't forget we've got Chris Goss and his latest history session. I think it's about Victoria Crosses from Fighter Command and North Africa, if I'm right. And if any of you fancy it, we had our first session of tap dancing at 10 o'clock today. So have a look at that on Facebook Live. It was fantastic. Fantastic.
I
Gary,
might keep that in this.
Oh, okay.
Everyone needs a new skill, don't they?
Absolutely. Kate, who does it, fabulous, absolutely fabulous. And of course, VUE Day is coming up, so please do tune in on VUE Day, because we've got some really special sessions happening on VUE Day, something that hopefully will entertain all of you. So thank you so much, all of you, for your support for this, and we'll see you very soon.
Cheers, thanks. Bye-bye.